2 years ago, Egyptians took to the streets against their country's first democratically elected president. Their hopes were high, but the military, led then by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, deposed the president. How stable is Egypt now? This is Inside Story. Hello there, a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. June 30th is a defining date in Egypt's troubled post-revolutionary transition. It was the date that Mohamed Morsi was inaugurated as president in 2012, and it was the same day, 1 year later, that millions of Egyptians took to the streets to demand Morsi's resignation. Many of those protesters felt that Morsi had failed to lead Egypt and that it was time for a change. But the June 30th protests would have far-reaching consequences. When Defence Minister Abdel Fattah el-Sisi stepped in to depose Morsi a few days later, it began an era that many say has returned Egypt to the worst excesses of military rule. Amnesty International says the young Egyptian activists who led the revolution against Hosni Mubarak are now languishing behind bars. It describes them as Egypt's generation jail. And it says the government has used the cover of a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood to settle scores with the activists who challenged it in 2011. The number of people jailed in the crackdown may be as high as 41,000. Many of them have been detained without charge or trial for long periods of time. And whilst protesters have been jailed, Amnesty says security forces responsible for human rights violations have walked free. Let's bring in our guests now for this story in Washington, D.C. We have Tawfik Hamid, Senior Fellow and Chair for the Study of Islamic Radicalism at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. In London, David Hearst, Editor of the Middle East Eye. And in New York, Dalia Fahmy, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Long Island University and a member of the Egyptian Rule of Law Association. Great to have you all with us. Plenty to talk about as we look at Egypt 2 years on from those protests that led to Morsi's ouster. First of all, I want to focus on this area of human rights in light of this report that's been released today by Amnesty International. It is, of course, entitled Generation Jail. Tawfik Hamid, what do you make of this report?
I see the report is talking about some factual reality about the possibility of high numbers. I'm not sure of the numbers they mentioned, but the possibility of having high numbers of people behind bars is there. But in order to understand this report correctly, you need to see the context of the situation of having very high level of terrorism also in the country and a desire to not to go into the path of Libya or Syria or Iraq. So the desire not to have group like ISIS controlling the country has led the authority to take some strong actions against any possibility that can lead to terrorism. So I see the report may have some factual information. However, it needs to be seen in the context of the very high level of threat of terrorism the radicals are creating in the country.
OK, so the government, the authorities are using security in Egypt as a reason to detain these people. But let me put it to you who these people are. They are young people. They are human rights defenders. They are students, Amnesty says, who only wear clothes with political slogans on them. I mean, they're young people from across the political spectrum. These aren't terrorists.
I see your point. However, many of these young people are asking for certain things that can actually allow terrorism to be aggravated. So the balance here is I see many of these young people do not personally want to do terrorism. But what they're asking for example, giving more freedoms to the jihadists and the radicals as part of human rights can end in more disasters to the country. So the balance here is between giving full forms of human rights at this stage and at the same time impeding the security of the country. So the balance is very difficult. When you ask for more human rights in such situation that will be abused by the radicals, then sometimes what you are asking for, while it could be correct theoretically, but in practice it can make things worse and can bring people like ISIS with no human rights at all to dominate the country. So the choice is hard, and I can see how difficult it is for the Egyptian authorities.
Dalia Fahmy, what do you make of that these young people may increase the level of threat of terrorism to Egypt?
I think we have to ask ourselves, what are these young people asking for? The initial moment of the revolution was asking for increasing transparency, increasing democracy, and removing the security apparatus from the everyday life of the Egyptian. I think it's disingenuous to say that people like Ahmed Maher and Ahmed Douma are asking for human rights to facilitate more terrorism in the country. I think that's a bit disingenuous. Let's look at the facts. There are over 41,000 political prisoners in Egypt. 3 former members of parliament have died in prison. The security apparatus has cracked down on many voices of dissent, really eliminating it from the public sphere under the guise of the new terrorism law and the protest law, which is leading to the sweeping pickup of many of these activists. If we look at the number of journalists, there are 26 international journalists being held in Egyptian prisons today, and we just saw the last one leave, the Spanish reporter leave today out of Egypt out of fear of being arrested. And so when you have a closing of political space, removing the voices of any voices of public dissent, and the elimination of real media outlets, what you're creating is an environment that is no longer in the democratic spirit of the initial revolution, but is leading to a level of social repression that is extremely antithetical to the values and norms of the initial revolution. I think to hide all of this under the guise of the security threat is pretty disingenuous.
Okay, David Hearst, why would you say that the government is particularly targeting these young people, detaining the very people that it was in fact lauding just a few years ago?
Well, that's really what's happened. I mean, ever since June the 30th, Sisi has basically turned on the coalition of political forces that supported the ouster of Morsi. Millions of people came on the streets against Morsi, but those millions have never been reassembled by the army. Furthermore, the political coalition that supported it initially, and we remember what Mohamed El-Baradei did on June the 30th, have shattered and gone. He is now back in Vienna, branded a traitor. You don't hear anything more of the National Salvation Front. Tamarod, the group of young people who collected millions of signatures, have now admitted that they were used by the Interior Ministry, and it's been revealed that their accounts were provided by the Emiratis in leaked recordings. This whole political coalition has fractured, and what we've got is Sisi and Sisi alone. He hasn't got a deputy, he hasn't got a functioning parliament, and it's very, very much one-man rule. This is very, very dangerous for Egypt. Egypt stands on the brink of a real explosion.
Tawfik Hamid, our other two guests there made it very clear that they see these mass detentions as a form of social repression, a repression of any voice that goes against one man in Egypt, and that is Sisi.
Look, the situation actually in Egypt was simply that you have very high level of radicals in the country. 70% of Al-Qaeda were actually from Egypt. A lot of leaders in Daesh and ISIS are Egyptians. So I believe the situation itself forced what we see today, the sudden democracy, as I called it one day, sudden democracy syndrome, in a society without preparing the society first with the democratic values before going to the elections was a real disaster. And this what pushed the country to reach that level. Because the society was not, people need to learn to respect the rights of their neighbor and the freedom of their neighbor as long as he is peaceful. But nowadays we have a cultural problem that necessitate this situation or make this situation as you see today. The democracy, when it happened in Egypt, was only at the level of the ballot. And this was a real disaster. And I warned against this before it happened, by the way. I called it sudden democracy syndrome. And this is what we see today. If Al-Sisi, let us say, had, like we have elections today, and for some reasons the Islamists use religion again to influence people and bring them back to power, it's a very emotional issue here. It's not a sane mind decision. It's emotional, using religion in politics. Then we can have a real disaster. So I think the situation now could be more stable until the people, and they are gradually changing to accept the democratic values, not just to the ballot. Yeah.
Okay.
So
David,
this
is
how I see it.
Basically, what you're arguing is that democracy, in particular 5 free elections, were a disaster for Egypt. That takes some doing.
No, I believe democracy is a great aim, but you need to do it at 3 stages. Let me just add this point. It's very important. I believe in democracy, but I believe in doing it at 3 stages. First of all, fight radical Islam. Second, teach people the democratic values of peaceful coexistence. Then go to the ballot. Going to the ballot first and thinking it is democracy was a major mistake. I believe so.
Okay, Tawfik, you say that first level of democracy. I'm just going to jump in for a second because I want to just, carry on with this point of detentions just for a moment. Stick with it for a second. You say this fight against radical Islam is important as the first stage of democracy, but would you not agree, can you not look at these numbers, 41,000 people detained, and agree that a lot of innocent people who simply oppose Sisi's rule have got caught up in this fight?
There could be some innocent people, and I believe the government has to take actions, and fast actions, to get them out of prison. But there were many people who were involved in the January 25 revolutions, like Ahmed Doma, for example. He admitted on TV that he was throwing bombs on certain places and on the police and the military. He admitted it on TV. So if you were in the position of the judge, what would you do? I like Ahmed Doma as a person and I respect him. But when he comes to admit that he threw bombs on gasoline bombs on certain places, including police places and army, then if you are the judge, what would you do?
Well, let's ask Dalia Fahmy that. If you were the judge, Dalia, what would you have done?
I think we're mincing words here and not really being genuine to the facts. Let's take a step back and look at reality. The rise of radicals, as the guest is saying, is only a byproduct of this current state of repression. Radicals and violence did not exist during the revolution or during the Morsi administration. There was not a single act of terrorism. All of this, the couple of acts have occurred under the Sisi administration. So I think if we're going to put, as he said, preconditions to democracy, the first being the elimination of radical Islam, this is a false narrative, a narrative that has actually been debunked in the political science literature. There wasn't an element of this in society. This was eliminated a long time ago in the 1970s. And we haven't seen any elements of it in Egypt. And so to put these disingenuous preconditions to democracy is actually telling the Egyptian people that you are really not a civil society that deserves freedom and justice. And so I think we need to take a step back and look at what is really happening in Egypt today. What you're seeing is a supreme executive that has eliminated the process of a parliamentary election for the past 2 years. Now, parliaments are the space where people actually have their voices heard. So when you eliminate the legislative assembly and you have a supreme executive who's really been passing laws like the terrorism law and the protest law through presidential fiat, what you're having is someone who is really become the face of the entire regime, and a regime that's increasingly repressive. And when people don't have avenues for dissent, it's natural, historically speaking, that we'll see a spike in resistance against the state. And so to say that resistance against the state existed and that needs to be eliminated before democracy is pretty disingenuous, because it's a byproduct of the increasing repression.
David Hearst, let me just bring in David Hearst. Preconditions to democracy, are they necessary?
Well, the other thing I'd like to add is that it isn't about elections, it's about the behavior of the judges. It's about the complete absence of the rule of law in Egypt. Firstly, you had police officers shooting demonstrations at Rabaa with impunity. You had massacres with impunity. And you have judges who stage grotesque mass trials of death sentences within an hour, without even bothering to, in some cases, to verify the identification of the people that they're sentencing. We started to see those death sentences being implemented, and in some cases, the people who were hung were in prison at the time of the alleged offence. I mean, this is rule of law. What really are we talking about? We're not simply saying that Egypt isn't ready for democracy. We're saying that the judges aren't ready to judge. And this goes throughout the system. This system is one of the most repressive, even by Mubarak's standards, blood-stained military regimes in the history of Egypt.
OK, well, let's continue on that thread for a moment, because the man who enabled the detention of those tens of thousands of government critics mentioned in Amnesty's report is, of course, Egypt's chief prosecutor, Hisham Barakat, and he was assassinated on his way to work on Monday morning. Cairo's security chief says a bomb was hidden in a parked car along the prosecutor's route and was probably detonated by remote control. Barakat is the most senior official to be killed in Egypt since the protests that led to Sisi's rule began in 2013, and his death has called into question the Egyptian government's ability to protect its people and stabilise the country. Tawfik Hamid, in response to Barakat's death, we had President Sisi coming out saying that he would have new criminal rules to speed up trials. And we heard that one of those laws would include judges having the right not to listen to witnesses' testimonies in trials. I mean, that is not a progression towards the rule of law.
Look, when you face a situation that the whole country can collapse, unfortunately, you may have sometimes to issue some temporary laws to control the situation. Otherwise, the whole stability of the country would be lost. Let us see an example. In the United States after September 11, there were some Patriot Act and some decisions that were taken to limit some of the human rights of people after September 11th. So, but the situation was one attack. When you compare it to hundreds of attacks in Egypt, then you can understand the magnitude of the problem and why it sometimes forces the authority to take such decisions. So I see the situation in Egypt is like US after September 11, but multiplied by 100 at least.
Dalia Fahmy, the whole argument for this crackdown and what may well be more intense crackdown in the coming weeks and months seems to be that it helps make Egypt safer, that it has to happen to control terrorism. Is Egypt a safer place today because of this crackdown?
First, let me say, as someone who's sitting in New York, it's pretty insulting to compare the couple of attacks that have happened in Egypt to 9/11. The second point I want to make is to really understand what is the security situation in Egypt today. You have a military and security apparatus that's really not policing the state, but is really policing its own people. The Sinai Peninsula is weaker today in security-wise than it ever has been. And that's why you can have the terrorist organization Ansar Beit al-Maqdis that is really a byproduct or emerges in the Sisi time period, claim some territorial affinity to IS. And this is really a byproduct of the lack of security in the state because the state is too busy policing its own people. When you have increasing repression, when you have a clampdown on civil society, when you have an educational and economic infrastructure that is continuing to dwindle. I mean, I know we're talking about politics, but economically, Egypt is worse off today than it has been in a long time. We're seeing the currency continue to be devalued. We're seeing that since the revolution, and especially in the past 2 years, the amount of people living in poverty today in Egypt is 49.98%. That means more than almost half of the population lives on less than $1.80 a day. When you have increasing economic conditions that are very constraining to the population, a lack of voice in civil society, and a supreme executive that's really eliminating any voices of dissent. I mean, very simply, there are no real political parties in Egypt when 2 years ago there were over 40. And so when you don't have the institutions of moving towards democracy or democratic transition, what you're seeing is an extremely repressed and frustrated society. So both economically and politically, Egypt is not only not doing well, it's moving towards the path of greater instability.
Dalia, you mentioned the economy there. I want to move the discussion onto that because that is possibly the one area in Egypt where Sisi can point to some successes. Tawfik, tell us how Sisi has managed to benefit Egypt's economy.
I see the credit rating of the country has increased since Sisi came to power. And this is a good sign because the credit rating will not increase for no reason. I'm sure the analysts there found enough reasons to increase the credit rating of the country. Another issue, economical issue, the pound did not collapse really, as Dalia said, to that extent. It's still within reasonable ranges and it didn't change much. There was some devaluation of the currency, but not that significant, not that huge. The third element is the ability of Sisi to stop or to decrease the energy subsidies without having a political backlash against him can tell you clearly that he did what other presidents couldn't do or didn't dare to do. He did it, and not only that, the people did not go in millions to demonstrate against him.
Egypt's spending on subsidies is at an all-time high right now.
Excuse me?
I said Egypt's spending on subsidies is at an all-time high right now.
The subsidies in energy, I'm talking about energy, not food subsidies. Certainly the price of gas increased, the price of electricity increased
it certainly was something that no other leader was able to do. I'm going to have to keep moving on. We're running out of time very quickly. David Hearst, Sisi has received a huge amount of money from the Gulf states. What's he done with it?
I'm sure the Gulf states themselves would like to find out because as a condition for the coup, he asked for and got 12 billion from Saudi Arabia. It was then in the time of King Abdullah. And he has received possibly up to $50 billion since then. The figures are just simply not known, but they are revealed. And there is no accountability. It went into army bank accounts. The army has still got an unknown proportion of the toehold of the portion of the economy. And if you were, for instance, to compare this, the impact of the army on the economy or its grip on the economy with, say, the Soviet Union and the military-industrial complex, would we tolerate in the West a situation where the army held anything up to 25–30% of the economy and it went absolutely all the way through? This runs against everything that we know in the West. But it is a completely corrupt system. And whenever, and this has been like this for decades, whenever MPs like Ayman Noor, not at all an Islamist, got up in Parliament and tried to get hold of the army's budget, it was shut absolutely in his face. So this is a long-standing problem, and I think it's just getting worse.
Tawfik Hamid, last word to you. You say that Egypt's progressing towards democracy. How long will we see military rule in Egypt?
First of all, it's not a military rule because people chose al-Sisi and people went into the streets. In more than 20 millions were in the streets demonstrating against Morsi, and they chose al-Sisi. And the best evidence for their choice is when he decreases the energy subsidies and they did not revolt against him. This can tell you clearly that there is huge respect for this man in the Egyptian street. Otherwise, they would have reacted against him. So it's going toward democracy. I see 5 years from now, I believe the country will be in a better situation. There are troubles we are facing, I do believe there is one single sentence I want to add, that the preconditions for democracy, see the effect of democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, and see the outcome of it in Iraq was ISIS.
Right,
so
okay, there we must leave our discussion there. Plenty of different voices on this issue. We'll be revisiting this show. Many thanks to Tawfik Hamid, David Hearst and Dalia Fahmy for joining us today. And thank you too for watching. As always, we welcome your thoughts. You can get in touch via our programme page on aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.